I'm going to teach you how to make grandma's molasses bread. This is actually a recipe I got from my husband's grandmother. I improvised it a bit, and I'm going to share that with you today. I used my Zojirushi bread machine that you see here. First thing you're going to do is just take out the pan. Inside, you'll see the little paddles. That is actually really helpful for kneading your bread. I decided to buy the bread machine because it's really simple to make a healthy loaf of bread. This is my husband's favorite bread by far. So the first thing you're going to do is use your grain mill. This is the Como Classic, and I'll leave all the links below in the description. You're going to need a total of 6 cups of freshly milled flour. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing 50-50, 50% Prairie Gold and 50% hard white wheat berries. Now you could do all white wheat berries. You could do like all hard white wheat berries. You could do 50% white, hard white wheat berries, hard red wheat berries, or whatever you prefer. So I'm using, like I said, 50% Prairie Gold, 50% hard white. Now, if you need a total of 6 cups of flour total, I generally just measure out a little under 5 cups of the wheat berries. I'm just adding the remainder of the wheat berries that I'm grinding. There's a lot of different grain mills out there. This one is a little bit more expensive compared to most of the grain mills, but I chose this one for a couple of reasons. One of them being that I can adjust the coarse, like how coarse the grains are. So rather than only being fine for flour, for example, I can make like cream of wheat, for example, and just have it more coarse. So that's one of the reasons why I purchased the Como Classic. The other one is it has a 15-year warranty, and it's just built really nice and it's really pretty. I really like it. So now I'm just mixing the 2 different types of flour together evenly. This next step is optional. What I'm actually doing is grinding the already ground flour. I'm grinding it again. Now, the reason being is because a few times I've made some bread. Occasionally, I will bite into a piece of the bread and it'll taste slightly gritty, even if I am grinding the flour at the finest setting. And I've read in a lot of different forums for freshly milled flour, people that use, freshly milled flour as part of their baking. One of the recommendations is to just run it through the grain mill a second time to make it even more fine. And I found that that's been really helpful in just making a more cohesive loaf of bread. But again, this is completely optional. Next, you're going to need 1 cup of milk. And I usually just pour it cold out of the fridge. And then I heat up water because you're going to need a cup of water. And I just add the heated water to the 1 cup of milk. And it becomes, more warm. Well, you want it warm. That's the way that I regulate the temperature. I just pour the cold cup of milk and then I add a cup of hot water, stir it together, and add that to the loaf pan. That's the first thing that you want to add to the loaf pan. You want to add your liquids first. So add the milk and water to your loaf pan. Now for this recipe, this is actually I would say probably for high altitude, at least it works really well for high altitude. I'm at 5,200 in Denver, Colorado, and my mother-in-law, who bakes this all the time, is around, I think it's like 4,500 or so in Kalispell, Montana. So this calls for just under 2 tablespoons of oil. I'm using olive oil. You can use any oil that you like. Well, generally, a baking oil, right? So olive oil works really well. Now, can you use the same recipe at sea level? I'm not sure. I haven't tried it. I've just noticed that there's a lot of recipes that I've tried at high altitude where I live, even with the bread maker, and it's just been a flop and a fail. And I just felt so defeated. So this recipe actually worked the first time around. So I was so happy about it. So if you do live at in a higher altitude area, try this recipe. I don't think you'll be disappointed. It's turned out really, really well every single time I've made it. The next thing I'm adding is 2.5 tablespoons of sugar. I'm using, it's called sucanat, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I believe stands for sugar cane natural, I believe. It's just a less processed sweetener. So I'm 2.5 tablespoons of whatever sugar you'd like. And now I'm adding a 0.5 tablespoon of salt. Next, you're going to add 3/8 cup molasses, which is just under a half a cup. So I'm just using the half cup measuring cup and just filling it almost to the top, not quite. So around 3/8 cup of molasses. So I just pour that in and then give it a good stir just to mix it up really well. I don't know that you actually have to do this step because the bread maker does a pretty good job at mixing everything together. But because the molasses is so thick, I just like to mix it up before I add the flour. Next, you're going to measure out 6 even cups of freshly milled flour. And by the way, if you haven't started milling flour, oh, there's so many benefits of it. I just started doing this probably a couple months ago or so. After I read about all the health benefits of real flour, like whole flour that you don't buy in the store on the shelves that becomes rancid because all the healthy oils are actually in the original grain that you grind when you mill your own flour. You don't get that in the supermarkets. You get the really crappy stuff in the supermarkets. And it's really, I believe, based on a lot of the research and a lot of things I've read and podcasts I've been binging on, I think it's a really big issue for a contributing factor to a lot of health issues. And so I've heard of really amazing things, tons of different health issues being reversed or at least significantly improved as a result of switching out, getting rid of the all purpose flour, getting rid of all of that processed flour and switching to freshly milled flour. And it's actually really affordable. So the big bags that you saw me pouring from, the whole wheat berries that you saw me pouring from earlier in the video, each one of those bags vary between like a buck 99 to, I believe it was like two something. I think the most expensive one was like 289 or something like that. So it's very affordable to bake your own bread, and it just tastes so much better. So many vital minerals and vitamins. It's just so much better for your health. So you're going to measure 6 cups total, add it to the loaf pan. You don't want to mix this around. You don't want the liquids at the bottom to come up to the top. The last step you're going to do before you add the yeast, you're going to make a little dome. Well, it's actually the opposite of a dome, right? It's a little indentation right in the middle of the flour. and you're going to add instant dry yeast. Keyword instant. Okay. You're going to add 2¼ teaspoons of instant dry yeast. Just add it right into that little indentation there in the flour. And now it's ready. Now it's ready to be placed into your bread maker. So just make sure that it's secure in your bread maker. And for your settings, you're going to set it to coarse 15, which is like manual mode, kind of. And then you're going to go through the different options. You're seeing me hit the cycle button up. Cycle through. The first thing that's going to come up is rest time. You're going to choose 18 minutes for rest, 15 minutes for knead. You're going to turn the shape off because we're not going to do any kind of shaping. Rise 1 is going to be 25 minutes. Rise 2 and Rise 3 are going to be 0 minutes. They're going to be turned off. And then you're going to bake for 35 minutes. And this is what it looks like when it's done baking. Looks fantastic. It took about an hour and a half total to bake this bread. Now, I generally let this cool down in the baking pan for a while, 20 to 30 minutes or so, and then make sure that you wear gloves to take it out safely if it's still hot. Usually it's pretty warm still. And then you're going to transfer it to a cooling rack. Now, I will also, once I take the pan out of the bread machine, I will actually still leave the bread in this pan for a little bit, maybe 10 to 15 minutes or so before I transfer it to the cooling rack. But that's up to you. I've just had I've had a big flop in the past where I took the bread out of the pan nearly immediately after it was done baking and it just collapsed. So I'm just trying to avoid that here. Now, what you're going to see when at the bottom of the bread, you're going to see 2 of those holes at the bottom. That's because of the paddles in the bread. So it's not going to be super aesthetically pleasing. It's not going to be this beautiful, perfect loaf of bread like my sourdough bread, for example. The sourdough breads that I bake are just super pretty. They're aesthetically pleasing. This one is not quite as aesthetically pleasing, but it is so delicious. My husband's addicted to this stuff. And like I said, it's very, very, very nutritious. It's like taking a multivitamin. Having a slice of toast is like getting your vitamins for the day and really great fiber as well. Now, what I do is wrap it in this beeswax. I found that to be one of the most efficient ways to keep the moisture in the bread, but not overly moist. If I put the bread in a Ziploc, for example, it tends to get too moist. So the beeswax is excellent for freshly baked bread and just keeping it, just storing it there, just keeps it moist and not prevents it from drying out, but not overly moist. It's perfect. I really like these beeswax wraps. So I'll leave a link to those in the description below as well. I decided to cut this open the next morning. So I'm just cutting into it. Let's see what it looks like on the inside. It's actually kind of a more of a dense crumb, but it's so good. It is so delicious. It's got such great flavor. It's hard to describe. I know it's molasses bread, but it's not like an overpowering molasses taste. It's just really, really good. I usually toast it. That's usually how I eat it. It's actually really good with sandwiches as well. I wouldn't necessarily say this is the best sandwich loaf, but it is excellent for toast in the morning. At least that's my preference. So a slice of toast with a little bit of butter on it for breakfast. It's wonderful. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. And if you try this spread, I'd love to hear how it turns out.